On a seemingly ordinary day, Flight 237 was scheduled to transport 132 passengers and 6 crew members from a bustling international hub to a smaller regional airport. It was a route the airline had flown hundreds of times, with a dependable aircraft that had earned the trust of countless travelers, the Boeing 737. Passengers ranged from business professionals to families embarking on vacations, each boarding the flight with no indication of the tragedy that awaited them. At the helm of this fateful journey was Captain Eric Stanton, a seasoned pilot with over 15 years of experience. Known for his calm demeanor and technical proficiency, Captain Stanton was, on the surface, the type of pilot any passenger would trust with their life. But beneath his professional exterior lay a darker reality, a man struggling with personal demons, including a growing dependence on alcohol. The co-pilot, First Officer Maria Lopez, was relatively new to the airline but had demonstrated a strong aptitude for aviation. She was diligent, detail-oriented, and respected among her peers. However, her inexperience in dealing with unusual cockpit dynamics would play a critical role in the events that unfolded. The day of the flight started like any other. The crew conducted pre-flight checks, greeted passengers, and prepared for takeoff. But unnoticed by the airline staff, Captain Stanton had consumed alcohol earlier in the day, believing he could mask the effects and carry out his duties without issue. His behavior during the briefing raised no red flags, as years of managing his addiction had made him adept at hiding it. As the aircraft climbed to cruising altitude, everything seemed routine. Passengers relaxed, unaware of the storm brewing in the cockpit. Captain Stanton's subtle errors in communication and delayed responses were dismissed by the co-pilot as minor lapses. After all, even seasoned pilots could have off days. But as the plane began its descent, the cracks in Captain Stanton's control became evident. His speech grew slightly slurred, and his commands lacked their usual clarity. First Officer Lopez, though concerned, hesitated to challenge her superior directly, fearing it might escalate the situation. Little did anyone aboard realize that the safety of the flight was already compromised. The pilot entrusted with their lives was no longer in full control of his faculties, and the consequences of this lapse would soon become horrifyingly clear. The Boeing 737 began its descent toward the runway, its engines humming steadily as the passengers prepared for landing. From the outside, everything appeared routine. The landing gear was deployed, the cabin crew performed their final safety checks, and passengers fastened their seatbelts, anticipating the familiar jolt of wheels touching the tarmac. Inside the cockpit, however, chaos was beginning to unfold. Captain Stanton, visibly impaired, struggled to maintain control of the aircraft. His hands fumbled over the controls, and his once confident commands were now erratic and disjointed. First Officer Maria Lopez, seated beside him, grew increasingly uneasy. She had noticed the captain's peculiar behavior throughout the flight, but had hoped it was simply fatigue. Now, as the plane approached the critical landing phase, her unease turned to dread. The cockpit voice recorder would later reveal a chilling sequence of events. As the plane descended, Captain Stanton failed to align the aircraft properly with the runway. His judgment was clouded, and his reactions were sluggish. The automated warning systems began to chime, signaling the plane's deviation from its glide path. "Pull up," the mechanical voice urged repeatedly, but Stanton dismissed it, slurring his acknowledgement. First Officer Lopez hesitated to intervene. Her position as a junior pilot and her respect for the captain's authority weighed heavily on her decision-making. She offered subtle corrections, suggesting adjustments to the approach, but Stanton either ignored her or responded incoherently. In her mind, the line between deference and duty blurred, leaving her unsure of how far she could push against her superior. As the aircraft descended further, the ground proximity warning system activated, signaling imminent danger. The co-pilot's instincts screamed for her to take over, but the moment passed in an agonizing flash. In her hesitation, a critical window for action had closed. At approximately 300 feet above the ground, Captain Stanton made a disastrous decision. Misjudging the plane's altitude and speed, he attempted an aggressive maneuver to correct the approach. The sudden action caused the aircraft to veer sharply, destabilizing its trajectory. The engines roared as the plane lurched violently, sending passengers into a panic. Seconds later, the Boeing 737 struck the ground just short of the runway. The impact was catastrophic. The fuselage shattered upon contact, spilling debris across the landscape. Flames engulfed the wreckage as fuel ignited, creating a scene of devastation that would haunt survivors and rescuers alike. The cockpit's final moments were a haunting mix of alarms, frantic commands, and deafening silence as the aircraft's systems failed. For the passengers and crew, those final seconds felt like an eternity, filled with confusion, terror, and helplessness. By the time emergency responders arrived, it was too late for many on board. The crash had claimed dozens of lives, leaving a handful of survivors who would carry the physical and emotional scars of that day forever. The scene at the crash site was nothing short of apocalyptic. Smoke billowed into the sky as flames continued to consume the remains of the Boeing 737. Emergency responders worked tirelessly, navigating the debris in a race against time to rescue any survivors. Shattered seats, personal belongings, and pieces of the fuselage were scattered across the field, a harrowing testament to the violent impact. Survivors, dazed and injured, stumbled away from the wreckage, their faces etched with shock and disbelief. Among them was a young woman clutching a child, both covered in soot but miraculously alive. Others were less fortunate, their injuries severe enough to require immediate medical attention. The cries of the injured mixed with the distant wail of sirens, creating a haunting symphony of despair. News of the crash spread rapidly, with media outlets broadcasting live footage of the wreckage. Families of the passengers, anxiously awaiting their loved ones at the destination airport, were ushered into a private room where airline representatives delivered the devastating news. Their anguish was palpable. Tears, screams, and disbelief filled the room as the reality of the tragedy sank in. Investigators from the Aviation Authority arrived on the scene within hours. Their initial focus was on recovering the black boxes, the flight data recorder, FDR, and cockpit voice recorder, CVR, which held the key to understanding what went wrong in the final moments of the flight. As they sifted through the debris, they began piecing together clues about the crash's cause, though the full picture was still unclear. The media quickly seized on the story, speculating about potential causes. Mechanical failure, weather conditions, and even sabotage were floated as possibilities. However, the revelation that the pilot had been intoxicated would soon dominate headlines, sparking outrage and disbelief. How could such a catastrophic lapse in judgment have occurred in an industry known for its stringent safety protocols? For the families of the victims, the aftermath was a time of unimaginable grief. Memorial services were held across the country, with communities coming together to mourn the lives lost. Photographs of the passengers, once filled with smiles and hope, now served as solemn reminders of what had been taken away. Among the survivors, the emotional toll was equally profound. Some grappled with survivors' guilt, questioning why they had been spared when so many others had perished. Others faced years of physical rehabilitation, their lives forever altered by the injuries sustained in the crash. The airline, under intense scrutiny, issued public apologies and promised full cooperation with the investigation. However, their efforts to repair their reputation were overshadowed by public outrage. How had a pilot been allowed to fly under the influence? What measures had failed to detect his condition before he stepped into the cockpit? As the investigation unfolded, the crash of Flight 237 became a symbol of systemic failure, a chilling reminder of the devastating consequences of human error. But for those who had lost loved ones, it was simply an unimaginable tragedy, one that no explanation could ever make right. In the weeks following the crash, investigators faced mounting pressure to uncover the truth behind the tragedy. The black boxes, recovered from the wreckage and miraculously intact despite the inferno, were rushed to a forensic laboratory for analysis. Within days, the cockpit voice recorder, CVR, began to reveal a chilling narrative. The captain of Flight 237, the very person entrusted with the safety of his passengers, had been intoxicated while at the controls. The findings were both shocking and damning. Audio from the CVR captured Captain Stanton's slurred speech, erratic commands, and delayed reactions during the critical moments of the flight. Analysis of the flight data recorder, FDR, showed abrupt and inconsistent control inputs during the descent, further evidence of impaired judgment. Investigators also uncovered communication lapses between the captain and First Officer Lopez, whose subtle attempts to correct the approach were either dismissed or ignored. Toxicology reports from the autopsy confirmed what the CVR had suggested. Captain Stanton had a blood alcohol concentration well above the legal limit for operating an aircraft. Further investigation revealed a troubling history. Despite his years of service, Stanton had faced personal struggles that included documented incidents of alcohol misuse. Airline records showed that Stanton had been flagged for erratic behavior in the past, but had undergone counseling and was cleared to return to duty. The investigation exposed systemic failures within the airline and the broader aviation industry. Pre-flight checks and crew assessments designed to detect impairment had failed to identify Stanton's condition before the flight. Airline policies for monitoring pilots with a history of substance abuse were found to be inadequate, relying too heavily on self-reporting and voluntary compliance. The findings sparked outrage among the public and within the aviation community. Families of the victims demanded accountability, filing lawsuits against the airline for negligence. Advocacy groups called for stricter regulations, including mandatory alcohol testing for all crew members before every flight. International aviation authorities quickly took notice. The incident led to a re-evaluation of existing safety protocols, prompting changes aimed at preventing similar tragedies in the future. Airlines around the world implemented mandatory random alcohol and drug tests for their crews, along with stricter oversight of pilots with a history of substance abuse. For First Officer Maria Lopez, the revelations were particularly painful. While investigators acknowledged her attempts to intervene, they also questioned whether more assertive actions on her part might have averted the disaster. The findings highlighted the need for better training for co-pilots, empowering them to challenge captains in high-stakes situations without fear of reprisal. The crash of Flight 237 ultimately became a watershed moment for aviation safety, its legacy marked by both grief and reform. It served as a grim reminder that even the most advanced systems and rigorous protocols are vulnerable to human error and lapses in oversight. As the official report was released to the public, it carried a solemn acknowledgement of the lives lost and the lessons learned. But for the families of the victims, no report or reform could ever fill the void left by their loved ones. The crash remained above all a personal tragedy, a haunting example of how one person's failure could ripple into unimaginable loss. The crash of Flight 237 left a scar that could never fully heal, serving as both a tragedy and a turning point in aviation history. It exposed vulnerabilities in a system that millions of people rely on daily for safety and security, forcing the industry to confront uncomfortable truths about human error and systemic oversight. For the victims' families, the pain was immeasurable. No investigation, apology, or policy reform could ever bring back their loved ones. The grief lingered long after the headlines faded, a constant reminder of lives cut short and futures left unfulfilled. Memorials and anniversaries became somber rituals where names were read aloud and flowers were laid in their honor. On a broader scale, the crash ignited conversations that led to critical changes in aviation safety protocols. Random alcohol and drug testing became the norm, and stricter psychological evaluations were introduced for pilots. Airlines implemented new training programs to encourage open communication in the cockpit, empowering co-pilots to act decisively when faced with unusual or dangerous behavior from their captains. Yet despite these reforms, questions remained. How many other pilots were quietly struggling with substance abuse, their issues hidden beneath layers of bureaucracy or personal shame? Could existing measures ever truly eliminate the risk of human error in such a high-stakes profession? For survivors, the crash was a defining moment, a dividing line between the lives they had before and the ones they were forced to rebuild afterward. Some turned their experiences into advocacy, pushing for safer skies and greater accountability. Others found solace in private reflection, cherishing their second chance at life while mourning those who were not as fortunate. As the aviation industry moves forward, the legacy of Flight 237 serves as a stark reminder of what's at stake. It's a call to vigilance, compassion, and constant improvement, ensuring that the lessons learned from this tragedy are never forgotten. Above all, it's a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, even in the face of unimaginable loss.